The phone buzzed, cutting through the silence of the night at 2:37 a.m. My daughter, Skylar, was on the other end, her voice shaky and low. Almost as if she was suffocating under the weight of her words. "Mom." "I'm at the precinct," she said, her breath ragged. "Darius. He's lying. He's turned everything around. They believe him, not me." I sat up instantly, the sleep evaporating as I gripped the phone harder. "I know what he's doing," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tell me everything." I heard her take a shaky breath, a sob buried deep within. Then she spoke again. "There's an officer here. I'm not sure, but he's acting like he knows me, like he's seen me before." Without hesitation, I shot out of bed, every instinct kicking in as I rushed to start the car. The streets outside my window were empty, a shadowy blur of quiet that felt wrong, that felt like time was slipping away. "Skylar, where exactly are you?" I asked, my voice calm but cold as steel. 10th Street, she replied, her voice breaking again. "Mum, he has a cut on his arm. Darius told them I attacked him with a knife. The blood, it looks bad." I clenched my fist so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. I knew this. I knew exactly what was happening. The abuser always turned into the victim, and the victim was always painted as the perpetrator. But never in my worst nightmares did I think this would happen to my own daughter. I gritted my teeth, my heart hammering. I didn't care that the traffic lights turned red or that the road was dark and deserted. Skylar was trapped in that precinct, and I would get there. Now. In 12 minutes, I was there in almost impossible time considering the distance, but nothing was going to stop me. I parked right in front of the precinct. Double parked without a second thought, and burst through the glass doors. The fluorescent lights inside made everything feel cold and sterile. A young officer looked up, his face pale, eyes wide when they met mine. He froze, hand mid-air like he was about to type something, then lowered it slowly. "Excuse me," he said, barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't speak immediately. I simply stared at him, my eyes unblinking, and for a moment I saw it fear, recognition. "Officer," I said, finally breaking the silence, "I'm here for my daughter, Skylar Hayes. And you're going to tell me exactly what's going on here." His badge read Miles. He stood up so abruptly his chair rolled back. His face paled even more. "Judge Estelle," he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. "Judge." I didn't realize. I didn't let him finish. It had been 5 years since anyone had called me Judge. 5 long years, but apparently that face still haunted some of them. "I'm here for my daughter, Officer Miles. Now, where is she?" Miles hesitated for a split second before pointing down the hallway. "She's in the waiting room." "We haven't booked her yet." "Captain Cole's reviewing the case personally." "Of course he is," I muttered under my breath. Men like Darius always had a way of getting the right people on their side. But I wasn't here to play games. I didn't wait for any further instructions. I walked past him, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the sound of them firm and steady, carrying years of experience and an unwavering resolve. The hallway felt like a maze. But I knew exactly where I was going. As I turned a corner, I saw her, the daughter I had raised, the daughter who now sat huddled in a corner, small and fragile. She looked so much like the girl I once knew, but now there was something different about her. Fear, shame, her eyes red and swollen from crying, locked onto mine the moment I stepped into the room. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking as she stumbled to her feet. I caught her just before she fell, pulling her into an embrace. Her body trembled, and I felt every sob that racked her fragile frame. And then, as I held her tightly, I felt the cold sting of something new, bruises, old marks, hidden under her sweater, pressing against my arm as she clung to me. Bruises that spoke of the silent torment she had endured long before tonight. I gently pulled her sleeve up, and she instinctively tried to cover it, but it was too late. I saw them finger marks. Dark and faded but still visible, evidence of countless times she had been held too tightly, hurt too many times. "Skylar," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "How long?" She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "I didn't want to tell you. I thought you'd think I failed, that I should have known better." I didn't want you to think." Her voice trailed off. I kissed the top of her head, holding her tighter. "You didn't fail," I murmured. "He failed you, and right now the system is failing us both. But I'm not going to fail you. Not tonight, not ever." I pulled away from Skylar and turned to Officer Miles, still standing in the doorway, looking more uncomfortable than I had ever seen him. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. "Officer," I said, my voice now steely, "I need the complaint report. I need to see Darius Croft, and I need to speak with Captain Cole, now." He swallowed hard. "Judge Estelle, I remember your face. You saved my sister years ago, Morales versus Morales. You issued the protection order that changed her life. I was 19. I was in the courtroom when you sentenced him." I didn't have time for nostalgia. The past couldn't save my daughter. I nodded curtly. "Where is he? Where's Darius Croft?" Miles glanced down the hallway nervously. "He's in with Captain Cole. They're going over the case, talking about what to do next, but—" He hesitated again, his words barely a whisper. "I didn't know your daughter was involved when they brought her in. Darius got here first. He was calm, convincing. Said she attacked him, said she needs psychiatric help." I closed my eyes. It was the same story I had seen 100 times before. The abuser turning into the victim. Darius Croft was playing his role perfectly. "Take me to her," I demanded. Miles hesitated, glancing nervously at the closed door where Cole and Darius were. "I don't know if that's such a good idea, Judge." "Captain Cole, take me to her. Now." His eyes widened. Without another word, he led me down the hallway. I entered the small room where Skylar was sitting. Her eyes were vacant, as if the fight had drained everything from her. But when she saw me, something shifted in her gaze. A flicker of recognition, a glimmer of relief. "Mom," she whispered, and with that she stood up, stumbling toward me. I caught her as she collapsed into my arms. Her body was trembling, but I held her tightly, feeling the weight of the world shift slightly off her shoulders. And then I saw it, the truth that had been hidden for so long. The bruises that covered her arms, the faint marks of old injuries that had never fully healed. My heart broke all over again. "How long?" I asked softly, though I already knew the answer. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I should have left sooner. I should have told you. But he said I'd lose everything if I did. He said no one would believe me." I gently cupped her face in my hands. "You didn't fail, Skylar. You survived. You've been fighting for your life. And now we fight for the truth. All of it. Do you understand?" Her tears fell freely now, not from fear, but from relief. We walked down the hall together, the silence between Miles and me almost unbearable. As we reached Captain Cole's office, the weight of the situation felt heavier. I knew exactly what was happening behind that door. 2 men, one with an injury and a well-crafted story, the other trapped in a corner, afraid to speak her truth. It was always the same. Miles knocked gently before opening the door. Inside, Captain Cole and Darius Croft were sitting across from each other. Darius, calm and collected, was practically using self-assurance, while Captain Cole looked like he'd been worn down by years of compromises. "Judge Estelle," Cole said, his voice tense, trying to offer a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wasn't expecting you here so soon." I didn't even look at him. My eyes were locked on Darius, who was sitting there, smug and composed, as if the world was still turning in his favor. "I'm not here to discuss anything with you, Darius," I said, my voice cold, cutting through the air like a blade. I'm here for my daughter. You've already made your accusations. Now, let's talk about what's really happening. Darius shifted in his chair, trying to look casual, but his hands betrayed him clutching the armrests as if they were the only thing keeping him grounded. You don't understand. Estelle, Darius said smoothly, but his voice was too controlled, too rehearsed. Skylar, she's been under a lot of stress lately. She lost control, and I was just trying to defend myself. I looked at him, really looked at him. The mask was slipping, and I could see the cracks beneath. His words were as hollow as his expression. How long have you been planning this, Darius? I asked, taking a step closer to him. How long have you been getting ready to paint her as the villain? His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw it fear, real fear. Not the false bravado he had tried to project. Don't act like this is new to you, I pressed. You've had a hand in this from the start. The lies, the manipulation. And I'm done letting you get away with it. Darius opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. Do you really think that anyone will believe this story? I asked, my voice rising slightly with anger. The neighbors are already speaking out. They've heard everything. They've seen what you've done to her. And soon, every single lie you've spun is going to fall apart. The tension in the room was unbearable. I could feel it pressing down on everyone in the room, but I wasn't finished yet. Darius was still trying to hold on to his dignity, but I knew the walls were closing in. He had made one mistake, and it was about to cost him everything. You have no idea what's coming. Darius, I said, turning to Captain Cole, you think you've covered all your bases. You think that your little network of friends and powerful people can shield you forever. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive. Slamming it onto the desk in front of Cole, the noise was sharp, slicing through the silence like a gunshot. Darius's eyes widened as he saw the flash drive. What is that? He stammered, his voice suddenly lacking the confidence it once had. That's your worst nightmare, I said, my voice calm, controlled. That's the evidence that will prove exactly who you are. The recording Skylar made of every threat, every hit, every time you tried to break her spirit, everything. The room was silent as Captain Cole turned the flash drive over in his hands. His eyes narrowing as he understood the gravity of the situation. Is this real? Cole asked, his voice shaking slightly. Do you really think I would have brought it here if it wasn't? I replied, my gaze never leaving Darius's face. Darius tried to regain his composure, but the mask was slipping fast. He was already backing away from the desk, his hands raised defensively. You can't use that. It's illegal. You can't record people like that. I smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant one. I know the law, Darius, and you should know better. Those recordings are admissible in court, especially when it comes to someone like you. You've been threatening her, controlling her, blackmailing her for months, and now it's all coming back to haunt you. I turned to Captain Cole, who was still holding the flash drive, looking at it as if it were a bomb about to explode. Captain, I suggest you connect this to your computer. I think you'll find the truth in there. And when you do, you'll understand just how far Darius has gone to destroy my daughter's life. Darius's face twisted in disbelief as Cole walked over to the computer, inserting the flash drive. The screen flickered to life, and Darius's carefully crafted world began to unravel. I didn't have to say another word. The recordings spoke for themselves, and I knew, deep down, that this was the beginning of the end for him. Before anyone could speak, the door opened. 2 officers entered, bringing with them the witnesses, the neighbors who had been listening, watching, and trying to make sense of everything. Ms. Evelyn Tate and Mr. Leonard Bell were their names. Their faces were lined with weariness, but their expressions were unwavering. We're here to tell the truth, Ms. Tate said, her voice clear, steady. That man, she pointed directly at Darius, has been abusing that poor girl for months. We heard everything. The screams, the pounding, the begging. We called the police 3 times. Every time we were ignored. Every time he said everything was fine, and you left, Mr. Bell nodded. But tonight, it was different. We heard glass breaking. We heard Skylar screaming, "He's going to kill me," then there was silence. And we saw him leave, with his arm bleeding, but walking out like nothing happened. That's not the behavior of someone who's been attacked, Ms. Tate continued. That's the behavior of someone who's been planning it for a long time. Darius stood up, his face contorting with anger. "You don't know anything," he shouted. "You weren't inside. You didn't see anything." But they didn't back down. Miss Tate spoke again, her voice calm but resolute. "We saw enough, and we're not staying silent anymore." Captain Cole looked over at me, his expression finally beginning to show the weight of what he was realizing. He glanced at Darius, who was now visibly cracking, the forehead crumbling like dust. "Enough," Cole said quietly, his voice no longer the firm tone I was used to. "Miles, take the statements from these witnesses. I want every detail, every date, every call." He turned back to Darius. "You're not going anywhere until we sort this out. And you might want to call your lawyer." As Darius sat down again, his face pale and his shoulders slumped, I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of satisfaction. The tide was turning. The truth was finally coming to light, and there was no hiding it anymore. The atmosphere in the office had shifted. Darius was no longer the calm, collected businessman he had tried so hard to portray. His composure had shattered like glass, and all that was left was a man who was cornered, who knew that his well-built lies were crumbling around him. The once immaculate man was now exposed for who he really was. I stepped back, allowing the officers to continue with their duties. Darius was still staring at the ground, trying to avoid eye contact, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. It was almost too easy to see him for what he was, no longer the confident man with connections, but a terrified individual who was realizing that his empire of lies was about to come crashing down. I didn't speak to him. There was no need. Darius Croft had already said everything he needed to say through his actions. He had manipulated, lied, and used his position of power to control and hurt others. But tonight, all of that was coming to an end. Captain Cole, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. His face, once full of judgment and doubt, was now full of something else, remorse. He glanced at me as I stood across from Darius, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. He had allowed himself to be blinded by power, by the prestige of Darius Croft. Now, the truth was unavoidable. "Judge Estelle," Cole said softly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I'm sorry. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I should have done more." I didn't reply immediately. There was no comfort in my heart for him, no sympathy. He had failed the people he swore to protect. He had let a man with influence walk free, while a woman, my daughter, sat in a holding cell, subjected to injustice and fear. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, Cole," I said quietly. "But we can start by doing what's right now. We can start by holding Darius accountable for everything he's done." There was a brief silence as the officers began to pull up the digital evidence from the flash drive. It was a meticulous process, ensuring that all of the files, the recordings, the documents were documented correctly. They'd have to be processed and analyzed in detail, but from what we already knew, there was no question that Darius was the aggressor. His lies were about to be laid bare for everyone to see. As the officers worked, I took a step back and found myself staring at the desk. The pile of papers, the files, and the flash drive were all reminders of just how deep Darius's control had gone. This wasn't just about physical violence, it was about years of manipulation, gaslighting, and control. And he had made it all seem normal. He had created a world where his lies were truth, where his actions were justified, and where his victims were the ones who had to hide in the shadows. A small voice broke through my thoughts. "Judge, we've found something else," one of the officers said, looking up from the computer. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer to the desk. "There's a folder," the officer said. "It's hidden in a way that we almost missed it. But it's filled with photographs of Skylar." I froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My stomach twisted. I had feared this. The surveillance. The secret control. But seeing that Darius had gone as far as to document her every move, to invade her privacy in the most horrifying way, it hit me like a punch to the gut. "What kind of photographs?" I asked, my voice suddenly tight. "Photos of her in private moments," the officer replied, his voice steady but laced with disgust. "In the shower. While she was sleeping. Even while she was changing clothes." I felt sick to my stomach. How long had he been doing this? How many times had he taken advantage of her, even when she had been vulnerable? This wasn't just abuse, it was control. A calculated effort to break her down, to ensure that she had no place to hide. She was never truly alone, never truly safe. And he had used every moment of that to his advantage. "What else is in the folder?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The officer paused, then continued. "There are also medical records, Skylar's private files, psychological evaluations, reports from her job. Everything he could use to make her look unstable. My words were barely a whisper, filled with disbelief. I turned back to Darius, who had been sitting in silence, seemingly defeated. "You used her medical records against her. You studied her like some kind of lab rat, trying to find ways to break her down even further." Darius didn't respond. He couldn't. There was nothing left for him to say. "We need to get this to the right authorities," I said, my voice firm now. "Every last bit of evidence. This man needs to be stopped, and I will make sure he never has the opportunity to hurt another person again." As the investigation continued, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settling deeper on my shoulders. But there was no time for hesitation. The pieces were coming together now, and I knew this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were finally on the right path. Skylar had endured so much, but now it was time for justice. Time to take down the man who had stolen so much from her and from all the other women he had hurt. The next few hours passed in a blur. We continued gathering evidence, organizing everything meticulously. The neighbors' testimonies were now officially on record, and the medical reports confirmed what we had feared. Skylar had been living in a nightmare for months, if not longer. Finally, as the day began to draw to a close, I received a call from Miles, Judge Estelle. "The cybercrimes team has completed their initial report," he said. "The evidence from Darius's computer is overwhelming. We've found recordings, photographs, emails, everything we need to prove this was a premeditated campaign of abuse." I didn't have to say anything. The silence between us spoke volumes. "I'm coming to the precinct," I said finally. "Make sure everything's ready. This is it." I arrived back at the precinct with a sense of grim resolve. The fluorescent lights of the building flickered above me, their cold, harsh glare reflecting the stark reality of everything we were about to face. The truth was on our side, but that didn't make this any easier. I had fought countless battles in my career, but this felt different. This time, the fight was personal. As I walked toward the front desk, Miles was waiting for me. His face was serious, but I could see the relief in his eyes. There had been a shift. Darius was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. The walls had started to crumble, but the hard work was just beginning. "Judge, we've gathered everything," Miles said, his voice low. "We've got the recordings, the documents, the witness statements, and the medical reports confirm everything. Darius is no longer in control of this narrative." "Good," I replied, my voice steady, but my thoughts were already racing ahead. "Where's his lawyer?" "Randall Quinn is with him in the interrogation room." He's been demanding to speak to Darius, but we've kept him waiting. We're trying to keep him off balance. I nodded, acknowledging his effort. Randall Quinn wasn't just any lawyer. He was a heavyweight, known for his ruthlessness and the deep pockets that supported his every move. He was exactly the kind of lawyer that people like Darius hired: slick, expensive, and more interested in winning than in seeking justice. But Quinn didn't scare me. He had no idea who he was up against. I walked toward the interrogation room, my footsteps echoing in the corridor, and as I passed by, I caught a glimpse of Darius sitting slumped in a chair, his face pale, the arrogance that once defined him gone. In his place was a man who had been exposed, his facade shattered, his carefully constructed world now in ruins. As I entered the interrogation room, Quinn stood up, his polished suit gleaming under the overhead lights. His eyes were calculating, sizing me up, trying to figure out my next move. But he had underestimated me. "Estelle," he said, his voice smooth, laced with the condescension I had heard from him before. "I should have known you'd be involved. This is a media circus now, isn't it? But you know, the truth doesn't always come wrapped in such a nice package." I didn't bother responding right away. I looked at Darius, sitting there defeated, his head lowered. For a brief moment, I felt the smallest hint of satisfaction. This was justice in motion. "I'm not here for a circus, Randall," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "I'm here to make sure that my daughter's abuser doesn't walk free. Not now, not ever." Darius looked up, his eyes darting between me and his lawyer. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered, his voice shaky. "None of this will hold up. You can't prove anything." I turned to him slowly, my gaze unwavering. "Oh, I can prove everything, Darius. And I will. Every word you've ever said, every threat you made, every lie you spun. It's all on record. It's all coming out." Quinn stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Estelle, I think you're forgetting one thing. Darius is a respected businessman. He has a reputation to protect. And the so-called evidence you have, well, that's not going to hold up in court. It's hearsay, it's manipulation. You're looking at a case that will never see the inside of a courtroom." I let out a small, controlled laugh. "You're wrong, Randall. The truth has a way of coming out. And when it does, you won't be able to spin it any longer." I reached into my pocket, pulling out the flash drive once more. The weight of it in my hand felt like a weapon, and I could see the shift in Quinn's expression when he recognized it. "I think you should take a look at this," I said, setting it down on the table with a quiet finality. The room was still for a long moment, the tension palpable. Darius's face had gone from one of anger to confusion, and Quinn's previously confident demeanor was now faltering. He hesitated for just a second before reaching for the drive. "I think you're about to find out just how wrong you are," I said quietly. The silence was deafening as Quinn connected the flash drive to the computer. As the screen flickered to life, the recordings began to play loud and clear. The voice of Darius Croft, calm and chilling, filled the room. "If you tell anyone, Skylar, you will regret it," the recording began. "You think your mother will save you? You think anyone will believe you over me? I'm Darius Croft, a businessman, a respected man. You're nothing." The recording continued, each word a nail in the coffin, each threat a confirmation of the pattern of abuse Skylar had endured. I saw the color drain from Darius's face, his eyes darting from the screen to me, back to the screen. His hands were shaking now. Quinn, who had been so sure of himself moments earlier, was now quiet. His face was pale, his lips tight as he tried to maintain composure. But even he knew that this kind of evidence was irrefutable. "This is illegal." Darius snapped, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't use that. It was recorded without my consent." "I think you know better than anyone, Darius," I said, my voice calm and firm. "In cases of domestic violence, recordings made by the victim are admissible. And I know you know that. You've been playing the system for years, but you've just played your last hand. I turned to Captain Cole, who was standing in the doorway, listening quietly. Captain, do what you need to do. Lock him up. He's not going anywhere. For the first time since I'd arrived, Cole didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice clear. Darius Croft, you're under arrest. The charges include aggravated assault, felony battery, threats, continuous domestic abuse, and non-consensual recordings. You're going to face trial for everything you've done. Darius opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His jaw clenched, his face contorting with rage and fear. He had no more power. It was over. As I watched the officers take Darius away, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was a deep, quiet satisfaction knowing that justice was finally being served. I walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing down the hallway. This was just the beginning. The trial would come, and there would be more battles ahead. But for the first time in years, I could breathe easier, knowing my daughter would finally be free from the nightmare Darius had created. The world outside the precinct was still waking up. People were going about their business, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the precinct. But as I stepped outside, I knew that for at least one person, the nightmare was over. The night had bled into the early hours of the morning, but I couldn't stop moving. Even as the day began to break, spilling light over the city, I felt like I had been awake for days. The adrenaline that had fueled my every action was now ebbing, leaving behind the weight of exhaustion. But I couldn't rest, not yet. Not when I had just taken down someone like Darius Croft. I walked through the precinct lobby, my mind still swirling with the events of the night. Skylar was safe for now, but I knew this wasn't over. The legal battle was just beginning, and the stakes were high. I had to make sure that everything stayed on track, that the system didn't fail us again. As I stepped outside, the cool morning air hit me. The streets were waking up, the usual hustle and bustle filling the air, but I felt like I was in a different world now, one that had been irrevocably altered by everything that had happened. Skylar's face, tear-streaked and full of fear, was burned into my mind. The thought of everything she had endured was unbearable. But the light in her eyes when she saw me, it was something I hadn't seen in so long. Hope. Real, palpable hope. I made my way to my car. The motion automatic now, my hands moving without thinking. It wasn't until I was sitting behind the wheel, the engine purring to life, that I allowed myself to breathe. The phone buzzed in my hand, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Jordan. I had barely spoken to her since I'd left the hospital, but she knew I would need to hear from her. Mom, Skylar's asking for you. She's awake. The doctor said they're keeping her under observation for the next few hours. I think she's starting to understand that she's not alone anymore. I smiled at the message, the weight in my chest easing just a little. This wasn't over, but for the first time, Skylar was free to heal, free to fight, and free to reclaim her life. As I drove toward the hospital, I felt a shift inside me. I was still the same woman I had been when I left the bench, the same judge who had fought for so many others, but now I was fighting for my daughter. And that made me more dangerous than I had ever been. The hospital was bustling with activity when I arrived. Doctors and nurses moved quickly through the hallways, carrying the weight of their responsibilities with silent grace. It was almost as if the world was turning normally, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. Everything had changed. I walked to Skylar's room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the door, I paused, gathering myself. I couldn't let her see me weak. Not after everything she had been through. She needed to know that she had someone who would fight for her, someone who would always be strong enough to hold her up when she couldn't stand on her own. I knocked lightly before pushing the door open. Skylar was sitting up in the bed, looking small and fragile, but there was something different in her eyes. Her usual guarded demeanor had softened, replaced with something I hadn't seen in a long time: vulnerability. It made my heart ache, but it also gave me hope. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to heal. "Mom," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Is it really over?" I stepped into the room, pulling a chair next to her bed. "It's over, Skylar," I said softly, taking her hand in mine. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." Skylar's lips trembled as she squeezed my hand. "I don't know what to feel, Mom. For so long, I thought I was just going to disappear, that no one would believe me, that he'd win." I brushed a lock of hair away from her face. "He didn't win. You're still here, and now everyone will know the truth. You're not alone anymore. We've got this." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at me, a fragile smile breaking through. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't want you to think I was weak. But I didn't know how to get out. I couldn't see a way out." I leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "You didn't fail, Skylar. You survived. That takes more strength than most people will ever know. And now we're going to make sure he never hurts you again." The door opened slightly, and Jordan stepped into the room, her eyes tired but determined. She walked over to Skylar's bedside and sat down next to her, taking her other hand. "Hey, sis," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "How are you feeling?" Skylar didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at Jordan, tears welling up in her eyes once again. Jordan didn't hesitate. She leaned forward and embraced Skylar gently, holding her tight. "I'm so glad you're safe, Sky," Jordan whispered. "You're so strong. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Skylar clung to her, and for a moment I just watched them, my heart swelling with pride. My daughters had been through hell, but they were still standing. Together, we were unstoppable. As the days passed, the reality of the situation began to settle in. We had gathered all the evidence, physical, digital, and testimonial, that we needed to move forward with the case against Darius. The recordings, the photographs, the medical reports, they were all irrefutable. And the more we dug into his past, the more we uncovered. I met with Assistant District Attorney Aisha Reynolds, who was handling the case. Her determination was contagious, and I could see that she wasn't going to back down. "No matter what Darius's money or connections tried to throw at us, this is solid." "Estelle," Aisha said, reviewing the evidence one last time, "we've got the recordings, the medical reports, the witness testimonies. We can make sure Darius never hurts anyone again." But I knew the legal battle wouldn't be easy. Randall Quinn had already begun his fight, pulling every string he could to discredit the evidence, to twist the narrative. He would try to tear apart Skylar's story. He would try to destroy every piece of evidence we had. But I wasn't going to let that happen. The judge who would be overseeing the case was a familiar one, Judge Sterling. He had worked with me in the past, and I knew he had a reputation for fairness, but he wasn't one to be easily manipulated. If anyone could see through Darius's web of lies, it was him. I stood before the judge, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "Your Honor, the truth is clear. Darius Croft is a predator. He has used his power, his money, and his position to manipulate and control my daughter for far too long. We have the evidence to prove it. I ask that you take every precaution to make sure he cannot harm anyone else again." Judge Sterling listened attentively, his face stoic. After a long pause, he nodded. "I've reviewed the evidence, and I'm confident in the case you've presented. Darius Croft will face trial for his actions, and he will be held accountable." The bail hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom was filled with a sense of tension, but also a quiet sense of victory. This wasn't just about Darius's guilt, it was about making sure the system worked, that justice was served. I couldn't afford to fail now. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter anymore. I was fighting for all the women who had been silenced, for all the victims who didn't have a voice. As I sat in the courtroom, I looked across at Darius. He was sitting with his lawyer, his face pale, his arrogance gone. The money and connections that had shielded him for so long had failed him. Randall Quinn stood up first, trying to pull the same strings he had always used. "Your Honor, my client is a respected member of the community. He has no prior criminal record. He has deep ties to this city, and there is no reason to deny him bail. His wife is the one with the history of erratic behavior, not him." I stood up, my voice calm and unwavering. "Your Honor, Darius Croft is a danger to society. He has used his power, his position, and his wealth to intimidate and control my daughter. He has manipulated the system for years, and now that the truth is coming out, he will stop at nothing to protect his freedom. The evidence against him is overwhelming. He should not be granted bail." Judge Sterling looked at both sides, considering the weight of the case. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Bail is denied. Darius Croft will remain in custody until trial. This case will proceed." As I left the courthouse, I felt a sense of resolve that I hadn't felt in years. This fight wasn't over, but it was one step closer to the justice Schuyler and all the other victims deserved. Darius Croft had been denied bail. He was going to face the consequences of his actions, and nothing could change that now. For the first time in months, Schuyler slept without fear. And that, in itself, was worth everything we had fought for. In the days following the bail hearing, everything seemed to slow down. The noise of the city outside felt distant, muffled, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, watching everything unfold below me. Schuyler was recovering, though her physical wounds were nothing compared to the emotional scars she carried. We spent time together, quiet moments, unspoken comfort between mother and daughter. She was finding pieces of herself that had been lost for so long, but the road ahead would not be easy. At the same time, the legal wheels began to turn. Aisha Reynolds, the assistant district attorney, had made it clear from the start that she wasn't going to let this case slip through the cracks. Every day, she pushed forward with methodical precision, making sure every piece of evidence was solid, every statement verified. But there was something hanging in the air, something I couldn't ignore. The calm, the eerie stillness before the storm. Darius's lawyer, Randall Quinn, had already begun working behind the scenes. I knew he would stop at nothing to discredit the evidence we had. He would attack Schuyler's credibility, claim the recordings were fabricated, twist the truth into something unrecognizable. It was what he did best. But I had seen this game before. He was a master of manipulation, but not nearly as skilled as he thought. I found myself spending hours in preparation, researching past cases, speaking with the officers who had gathered the evidence, and making sure that every loose end was tied up. This was the fight of my life, and I wasn't about to lose it now. The trial began quietly. There was no dramatic fanfare, no immediate fanfare in the courtroom, just the steady hum of a system that was finally working the way it was supposed to. Darius sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and worn, his eyes darting nervously. No longer the confident businessman he had once been. Now he was a man on the edge, clinging to the last vestiges of control. Across from him, Schuyler sat beside me. Her hands trembled as she clutched her lap, but her eyes were determined. I could see the strength in her that had been buried beneath years of abuse. She wasn't the terrified girl who had called me that night in the precinct. She was a survivor, and now she was about to face the man who had hurt her, who had nearly broken her. Aisha stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice calm and commanding. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the case before you is one of the most disturbing we've seen in a long time. This is not a case of a simple domestic dispute. This is a case of calculated manipulation, control, and abuse. The defendant, Darius Croft, has used his power, his money, and his connections to torment his wife, Schuyler Hayes, for years. He has abused her, threatened her, and tried to silence her at every turn. We will present evidence recordings, photographs, medical reports that will show you exactly how far he went to maintain his control over her. This will be a case of not only criminality, but a violation of basic human rights. I glanced at Darius as Aisha spoke. His face was still blank, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. He was trying to remain calm, but the cracks were starting to show. This wasn't the story he had told everyone, and for the first time, he was facing the consequences of his actions. As Aisha continued, I felt my chest tighten. This was it. This was the moment we had all been waiting for. Skylar's voice would finally be heard. The truth would come to light, and no one, not even Darius, could hide from it anymore. The days of the trial blended together into a blur of testimony, exhibits, and cross-examination. But with each passing moment, I saw the walls around Darius tighten. We had the evidence we needed. The recordings Skylar had made were the centerpiece. Each one played like a damning confession, each word confirming what we already knew. Darius was not the victim. He was the perpetrator. The medical reports corroborated the injuries Skylar had suffered, showing bruises in various stages of healing, fractures that had been ignored, and signs of prolonged abuse. The photographs that Darius had taken in secret were displayed for the jury, evidence of his invasive surveillance. His total control over Skylar's every move, the neighbors who had witnessed the constant fighting, the loud crashes, the terrifying screams they spoke out in the courtroom, their voices steady as they recounted what they had heard and seen. It wasn't just Skylar's word anymore. It was the truth, supported by countless pieces of evidence, backed by witnesses who had seen through Darius's lies. But the most powerful moment came when Skylar took the stand. She was trembling, her body rigid with fear, but she stood tall. I saw the strength in her, even as her voice wavered. She told the jury what had happened. She told them about the nights when she would lie awake, praying for the courage to leave. She spoke about the emotional and physical abuse she had endured for years. How she had tried to fight back, but Darius always found a way to make her feel small. Powerless. Her voice cracked as she recalled the night she finally fought back when Darius had pushed her too far. I couldn't do it anymore, she said, her words barely audible. I fought for my life. I didn't care what happened. I just knew I couldn't stay there and let him keep hurting me. The room was silent as her words hung in the air. The jury's eyes were fixed on her, the truth of her words cutting through the room like a knife. Darius shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting from Skylar to the jury to his lawyer. There was no escape now. By the time we reached the closing arguments, it was clear that Darius was losing. The evidence, the witnesses, the recordings, it was all there, undeniable and damning. But Randall Quinn was not one to give up easily. He stood up and addressed the jury, his voice smooth and calculated. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot of testimony. But what you have to remember is this. This is a case built on accusations. Accusations made by a woman who had a history of emotional instability, a woman who has already shown that she was capable of violence. My client, Darius Croft, has done nothing but try to protect himself and his family. These recordings? They were made under duress. These photos? In the heat of an argument, they don't show the full picture. This is a woman who is desperate to ruin the life of an innocent man. Don't let these lies cloud your judgment. His words were carefully crafted, designed to plant doubt, to make the jury question everything they had heard. He was good, but I wasn't worried. The evidence spoke for itself. Skylar had been brave enough to speak her truth, and now the jury would hear it. Don't be fooled, I whispered to myself as Quinn continued his argument. This time, the truth will win. The jury deliberated for hours. The tension was unbearable as Skylar and I waited in the courtroom, every minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, the door opened. The jury returned. The room grew quiet as they filed back into their seats. Judge Sterling called the court to order. "We have reached a verdict," he said. His voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. The room held its breath. Darius Croft, you are hereby found guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, felony battery, continuous domestic abuse, threats, and illegal surveillance. The words rang out, clear and final. Darius's face went white as the reality of the situation hit him. He slumped back in his chair, as if the weight of the world had just crushed him. There was no more pretense. No more lies. Skylar squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. The tears that welled in her eyes were not of fear or sadness, but of relief. It was over. The man who had spent years controlling and tormenting her had been held accountable. And now she could finally begin to rebuild her life. The fight was over, but the healing had just begun. Skylar had been through hell, but she had come out stronger on the other side. She was free, and that was something no one could ever take from her. The days following the verdict felt like a surreal blur. Skylar was free, but the battle was far from over. The conviction of Darius Croft had been a victory, but the true challenge lay in the road ahead, the road to healing, to reclaiming her life, and finding peace after years of terror. For the first time, Skylar could breathe. But breathing, I learned, was only the beginning of what she had to do to rebuild herself. In the weeks that followed, we settled into a quiet routine. I took time off from work to be with her, to give her the space she needed to heal and rediscover herself. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom, filled with fear, unsure of whether she'd ever get justice. She was a survivor now, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. We spent our days together, not always talking about the past, but just being. Cooking meals, watching old movies, walking through the quiet parks near my home. There were times when Skylar would talk, her voice trembling as she revealed the deepest fears she had kept locked away for years. And there were times when we sat in silence, to people in the midst of a storm, finding comfort in the stillness. But we never talked about the trial, never discussed the torment she had endured at the hands of Darius. Those were not things we needed to relive. It was clear to me that the hardest part of Skylar's healing process wasn't the physical pain, it was the emotional weight. The way Darius had controlled every aspect of her life, manipulated her thoughts, and made her believe that she didn't deserve anything better. The truth was that Skylar had never been weak. She had only been trapped in a cycle of fear that she didn't know how to escape from. But now that fear was beginning to lose its grip on her, the first real breakthrough came when Skylar decided to go back to school, photography. It had been her dream before Darius had taken control of her life. For years, she had put aside her passion for fear of upsetting him, for fear that her dreams might somehow take away from his. But with him gone, Skylar felt a spark of possibility again. I could see it in her eyes, the woman she could have been, the woman she was becoming. But the healing was not a straight line. There were nights when she would wake up in a cold sweat, screaming, her body trembling as she relived the abuse. I held her, whispering softly, reminding her that she wasn't alone, that the nightmare was over. And as the days went by, I saw her begin to let go of the past, piece by piece. She cried, she fought, she questioned everything she had believed about herself. But every time, she came back stronger. There were days when she smiled, when she laughed, when she finally allowed herself to feel something other than pain. And then there were the darker days, the ones where she felt lost, unsure of what her future looked like. But even on those days, I was there, reminding her that she was still the person who had stood up to the man who had tried to break her. She was stronger than she knew. Skylar started seeing a therapist, someone who could help her process the trauma she had experienced. Together, they began to peel back the layers of her past, the things she had locked away for so long. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but every session brought Skylar closer to understanding who she really was. She wasn't Darius's victim anymore. She was Skylar Hayes, a woman who had fought for her life, and who was now free to define her future on her own terms. One afternoon, as we sat together in the living room, Skylar looked at me and said, "I don't know if I'll ever fully be okay, but I know that I'm going to try. I'm going to figure out who I am again, and I'm going to do it on my own. I'm not defined by what happened to me." I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. "You never were, Sky. You've always been more than what he made you believe. And you've already taken the first step. You're free." It wasn't long before Skylar found a way to give back. She volunteered at a local shelter for women who had gone through what she had. She didn't want to be just a story. She didn't want to be a symbol of pain. She wanted to be a voice for those who felt they had none. Every day she worked with other survivors, helping them find the strength to leave, to stand up for themselves, to know that they deserved more than the world had given them. And with each woman she helped, Skylar grew more powerful, more confident. She became a quiet advocate, using her own experience to help others find their way out of the darkness. In her own small way, she was changing lives just like she had changed her own. I saw a new light in her eyes now, one that had been missing for so long. Skylar wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, but it wasn't just about helping others. Skylar also began to reclaim the things she had lost. She enrolled in a photography course, something she had wanted to do for years, but had been too afraid to pursue. It was a small step, but it was hers, and that meant everything. She began to experiment with new styles, capturing moments and emotions that spoke to her on a deep level. Photography became more than just an art form. It became her way of expressing everything she had been through and everything she was becoming, and as for me, I continued to stand by her side. I was still her mother, her protector, but now I was watching her blossom into someone I had always known she could be. It was bittersweet, seeing her take these first steps without me as her crutch. But I was proud. Proud of the woman she was becoming. Proud of the strength she had shown, the resilience she had built, and the courage it took to start over. Darius's conviction had marked the end of one chapter, but Skylar's story was far from over. It was just the beginning of her new life. The aftermath of Darius's abuse wasn't easy to confront, but it was essential. Skylar had to make sense of everything he had taken from her: her identity, her dreams, her sense of self-worth. But the more she worked to reclaim those pieces, the more she realized that he hadn't won. Not really. He had taken so much, but he could never take away her ability to heal, to fight back, and to become the woman she was meant to be. One day, as we sat together, discussing her future, Skylar looked at me and said, "I want to tell my story. Mom, I want people to know that they can survive. I want to show them that there's hope, even when it feels like there's none left." My heart ached, and yet, in that moment, I knew that this was Skylar's gift. Her voice was the most powerful thing she had, and now she was using it to help others. As the months passed, the once terrifying shadow of Darius began to fade. But his actions would never be forgotten. They couldn't be. He had tried to break her, to destroy her spirit. But Skylar was not only still standing, she was thriving. And she was ready to help others do the same. Together, we had fought through the storm. Together, we had survived. And now, together, we would face the future stronger, freer, and ready to build the life we had always deserved. Time passed in a way that felt both slow and quick all at once. Each day Skylar grew a little stronger, a little more sure of herself, and though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer controlled her. She had faced down the darkest corners of her life and come out the other side. Now, she was reclaiming everything that had once been taken from her. She found herself reaching out to others who had walked the same path, those who had suffered in silence, those who feared they could never break free. Skylar began speaking at local events and meetings for domestic violence survivors, sharing her story with raw honesty. It wasn't easy for her. Speaking about her abuse, reliving the darkest moments of her life, took everything she had. But every time she stepped up, every time she shared her truth, I saw her grow more and more into the woman I always knew she could be. What amazed me most was how much she inspired others. Women who had once felt trapped, invisible, and powerless found strength in her words. They wrote to her, thanked her, and shared their own stories. Skylar had become a beacon of hope for those who had none, and in the process, she began to find a new sense of purpose in her own life. One evening, after a speaking engagement at a women's shelter, she came home exhausted but glowing. I could tell she was still processing everything she had just shared. But there was a light in her eyes that wasn't there before. "Mom," she said, sitting down beside me on the couch, "I don't think I realized how much I needed this. I've spent so long hiding. But now I feel like I'm really starting to live. Not just survive, but actually live. I want to keep doing this. I want to help women who are still stuck." I could see the depth of her conviction, the fire that burned behind her words. "I'm proud of you, Sky. I always have been. But now you're changing the world. And you're doing it on your terms." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It feels good to be able to help people. To know that my story, that my pain, can actually make a difference. It's like I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be free." That was the turning point. The moment I realized that Skylar wasn't just living for herself anymore, she was living for others too. And that in itself was the most powerful form of healing I had ever seen. With each day, Skylar's confidence grew. She continued to pursue her passion for photography, taking courses and working on new projects. She had always had an eye for capturing moments, and now her photographs told a deeper, more personal story. They weren't just images anymore. They were pieces of her journey. Through her lens, she was able to express everything she had experienced: the pain, the strength, the resilience, and share it with the world in a way that words alone couldn't. As her photography skills improved, Skylar began to gain recognition. She started showcasing her work at local galleries, her photos telling stories of survival, hope, and transformation. Each photograph was an expression of her solar glimpse into the healing process she was undergoing. But it wasn't just her professional life that was evolving. Skylar was also beginning to build deeper, more meaningful connections with people. She started spending time with friends who supported her and who truly understood her journey. No longer the isolated, fearful woman she had been, Skylar was building a new life for herself, one that was full of possibilities, of love, and of connection. Her relationship with Jordan also grew stronger. The sisters, once divided by the trauma that had consumed their lives, were now closer than ever. They spent weekends together, enjoying simple pleasures like hiking or cooking dinner. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged in the fire of their shared experiences. Jordan had always been there for Skylar, but now they were both starting to heal, and their sisterhood was no longer defined by the darkness they had endured. It was a bond built on strength, trust, and love. One day, as Skylar prepared for an upcoming event where she would be speaking to a group of high school students about healthy relationships and recognizing the signs of abuse, she sat down with me. She looked more confident than ever, her posture strong and her gaze unwavering. "I think it's time, Mom," she said softly. "It's time for me to write that book I've always wanted to. I want to tell my story in a way that reaches people who need to hear it, who need to know they're not alone." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me as I listened to her. I knew how much this meant to her. Writing her story would be an incredibly personal journey, but it would also be a powerful one. It would allow her to share her truth with the world and give her the opportunity to help even more people. "You're ready, Skylar," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You've been ready for a long time. And when you share your story, you're going to change lives. You already have, Skylar smiled, her eyes sparkling with purpose. It's not just my story anymore. It's everyone's, and that's what makes it powerful. As she embarked on the journey of writing her book, I knew this would be another chapter of growth for her, one that would further solidify her legacy as a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She had become not only a survivor, but a force for change in the world. The days of fear, of silence, of walking through the world as though she didn't belong, those days were behind her. Skylar had come into her own, and the woman she had become was nothing short of remarkable. But it wasn't just about her. Skylar had given so many others the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light. She had shown them that survival was possible, that healing was possible, and that no matter what, you are never alone. There were still hard days, of course. There always would be. But those days didn't define her anymore. Skylar had taken control of her own destiny, and she was no longer a victim of her past. She had turned her pain into purpose and her scars into symbols of strength. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also full of promise. Skylar had spent so many years being someone else's definition of who she was supposed to be. But now she had the freedom to define herself, and as her mother, I couldn't have been prouder. Together, we had walked through fire. Together, we had overcome the impossible. And together, we were ready to face whatever came next with love, strength, and the unshakable belief that we could conquer anything. As the months went by, Skylar's transformation became more evident to everyone around her, but especially to herself. There were no more whispered apologies or second-guessing. The woman who had once been silenced, who had cowered under the weight of Darius's abuse, now stood tall, proud of who she had become and determined to help others do the same. The book she had started writing slowly came together. It wasn't easy for her, reliving the pain, the heartbreak, the fear, but Skylar had become not just a survivor, but a storyteller. Her words were raw, her words were powerful, and her words were meant to heal. She had not only faced her past, but also used it to forge a new future. Writing her book was no longer just about sharing her journey. It was about creating a legacy of hope, of showing others that healing was not just possible, it was inevitable. As the manuscript neared completion, Skylar came to me one evening, a certain look of satisfaction on her face. "It's almost done, Mom," she said, her voice steady and full of purpose. "I think it's time I finally tell my story to the world." I smiled at her, a deep, proud smile that came from knowing she had overcome so much. "Skylar, you've always been stronger than you knew. And now the world is going to see just how powerful you are. You're going to inspire so many people." "I hope so," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "I really do. I want to make sure no one else feels as alone as I did. I want them to know that there's always a way out." The release of her book was met with an outpouring of support. Readers from all over the world reached out to her, thanking her for being their voice, for showing them that they could survive and thrive. Her words resonated with so many, touching hearts and opening minds. Skylar's vulnerability had sparked a wave of understanding that she never could have anticipated. And for the first time, she realized that by telling her story, she was helping not just others, but herself.